Okay. Good. Okay, thank you very much. I'm so happy to be invited to this workshop. And in fact, when I was asked to come and talk about something that I've been working on, I really had a great deal of trouble figuring out what is it that I want to talk about. Do I want to talk about work we did on Alzheimer's disease and schizophrenia, nicotinic pathology and oscillations? Do I want to talk about exact reduction models? Do I want to talk about stuff we've been doing on connectome with Damien Battaglia, right? And I think I lucked out because I decided to talk about something that so far no one's talked about. Okay, all right. And so what I wanted to talk about today is about working memory. Okay, and the work we've been doing over the past few years and trying to understand how periodic correlated activity or oscillatory activity actually can play a role of dynamic gator in working memory, right? And you know, we can certainly agree that working memory is in fact something that might actually link a lot of the interests here, and there's a primary pathology, for example, that you see in Alzheimer's disease, schizophrenia, a number of other cognitive disorders. Okay. All right. And so just to get everybody on the same wavelength, right? So if we think about working memory, so the way I think about it, and I learned from Jonathan Cohen, who was in my doctoral committee, really I think about working memory as an active process, you know, that is not only there to store the information, right? So it's not working memory, it's working with memory, right? That it links, you know, the temporal gap between when you see something and then you must, or hear something and you must use it in order to produce specific responses, you know. And it's also very important for cognitive control. So the idea that you don't execute, you know, habitually prepotent responses when they're not appropriate, but actually inhibit those, right? And it has very specific characteristics, right? As a rapid onset, you have to remember it like that. It has to be rapidly cleared because it's capacity limited, right? That's it, okay? And therefore, it must be selectively gated, right? Stuff that you don't need in order to perform the task at hand should really be not loaded and not used in the working memory, right? It should be ignored in some ways, right? Okay, right? And you can test working memory functions in the whole class of behavioral tasks that are called delayed response tasks, right? So if you're a behaviorist, you might call them, you know, trace conditioning task, trace response tasks. All right. And so there's a whole host of these tasks, you know, and one of the sort of paradigmatic examples of these tasks that I will talk about is the delay match to sample. Okay, and the way it works is that, you know, your subject is asked to fixate on a screen. Okay, all right. Then there is a sample or a stimulus that is flashed. Okay, all right. And then there is a delay period during which the subject should do nothing, right? Not respond to anything. And during this delay period, there could be a whole number of different stimuli that appear, okay, that the subject needs to ignore, okay. And during the response period, for example, when there is a match or there is a cue to respond, right, the subject should respond correctly depending on the stimulus that is shown, right? So if it's a delay match sample task, right, the animal or subject should respond when it sees a visual stimulus, for example, here that matches the sample that it was supposed to remember. All right. And so the important thing is that if there are distractors that are shown in the interleaving delay period, right? So these distractors should, you know, be prevented from interfering with the memory trace. Okay. Okay, all right. And so now this has been an area of classic study in systems neuroscience, all right? And activity that is related to performance of various parts of the task has been observed in almost all of areas of the neocortex. Okay, all right, and I will focus mostly on the prefrontal cortex and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex data. Right. Yeah. Okay, and if we look at neural recordings from these areas that have been done over the last decades, right, since the 20th century. Okay, what we see is that there's telltale persistent activity, right, that is selective to the stimuli that needs to be remembered, right, that appears after the stimulus, when the stimulus is presented, and persists, right, during this delay period when there's no relevant sensory stimulus. Okay, all right. So, here you see a rastergram, right, of a cell that responds from trial to trial to the red, right, doesn't respond to the blue, and then you can look at the firing rate, sort of populate firing. Okay, all right. So now, in the talk, in my talk, I will talk about this persistent activity as being constant, but there's been lots of work recently that shows that, in fact, this is much more complicated and much richer, but in all ways, there is some kind of self-persistence that happens. Okay, all right. And so this self-sustained activity is rapidly activated at the sample stimulus. It's maintained during the delay period. Right? It has to be robust to distractors. There's data that shows when it is perturbed by the distractor, the animal cannot perform the task correctly. Okay, all right. And it has to be, and it appears to be rapidly deactivated at the response. Okay, and then of course there's caveats to that, because there's very nice work coming out from groups in this city that shows that there are serial correlations in responding between trials. Okay, but basically, if you don't deactivate this, the animal starts to make errors on the subsequent trials. Okay. All right. And interestingly, if you start looking at recordings from the PFC on these delay match to sample tests with distractors, and this is data from Earl Miller's lab, actually fairly dated data, but data nonetheless. Okay. All right. And so if you look at the responding on correct trials versus non-correct trials for the sample, the match, and the interleaving distractors. Okay, and I think I'm going to screw it up now. Okay, so all right. So basically what you see, which is interesting, is that you see a response to every stimulus that is shown, okay, when the stimulus is shown. So there's this sensory response. Okay, all right. And on the successful trials, this activity that persists between the stimulus presentations is there. Okay, so it's protected from the distractors, and it fails when it's there on successful trials, and it disappears on the most unsuccessful trials. Okay, all right. So this presented us with a kind of an interesting question. If these distractors should not interfere with the memory trace, then how could it be compatible with seeing these robust transient responses to them, right? Potentially in exactly the same network, right? And furthermore, there's an interesting piece of data that if you try to sort of ask the questions, is the firing rate response to the distractor presentation always below the item initial response, or is it above? Right? What you find is that there's no rhyme or reason. Okay, and that's independent of the animal's success. Are we okay? We're good. Okay. All right. So whether the animal can do the task or cannot do the task, right, does not depend on the response to the distractor being weaker than the response to the sample. And in fact, sometimes it can be much stronger responses to the distractor. Right. So then how could it be? Right. So if you think about it, you can say, okay, well, there's the standard way to think about it is that you have a module that encodes somehow the item, and you have modules that encode somehow the distractor items, right? And they interact with each other by cross inhibition. If you propose that kind of an idea, then necessarily the response to the distractor has to be lower than to the item. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. Okay, unless and then you can, put bells and whistles on it and sort of fix it maybe, but conceptually, that's what you have to do. Okay. All right. And so if you kind of boil it down, what needs to happen during a working memory task, right? What we thought about is that, there are several operations that are necessary, right? First, you need to load the information into the whatever neural population that will hold the trace online, okay? You need to maintain it, right? You need to prevent the irrelevant sensory stimulus from being loaded into its working memory buffer and perturbing the trace. And then you need to rapidly clear it, okay? All right. And if you think about it, these, in our sort of mind, right? These different operations are also associated with the different gating modes, right? Here you must gate in the the item, right? Here you have to have some kind of a selective gating mode, right? Where you maintain, but the gate to the destructor is closed, right? And here you got to gate everybody out. Okay, and you have to do this rapidly, right? So, of course, one idea you might propose on how to do this rapidly is by some kind of a rapid synaptic modification, right? Okay, all right. We thought that maybe there is an alternative to that idea, okay? And the inspiration that we got for this sort of alternative idea that we've been pursuing for a while is, this sort of a alphabet soup of cortical oscillations, okay? And in particularly, I was supposed to have alpha, beta, and gamma hidden somewhere in the soup. Okay, whoops, but they somehow got eaten. Okay, and so you will see, I will focus out of this alphabet soup, I will focus on alpha, beta, and gamma bands. Okay, and we'll, alpha, gamma, alpha, and theta. Sorry. Okay, all right, I'll leave out beta for now. We've been working on beta lately, but it's not on this stuff. Okay, all right, and so what happens to these oscillatory activities, at least power, during these delay response tasks? Okay, so what you see is that during these delay response tasks, you see kind of a multiple frequency oscillations arising and disappearing during different task periods. Okay. Does that meet you? Somebody else changing something. Okay, thank you. All right. So if you look at what happens to gamma, sort of higher frequencies. Okay, so I'm kind of collapsing gamma and beta in this talk. Right. What you find is that they're strongest when the sensory stimuli are actually presented. Okay, so one might get an idea that these higher frequencies, say in the gamma band, right, they are related to the loading of information, of sensory information, into this active working memory buffer, if you want to call it. Okay, all right. Now, if you look at the theta frequency, all right, so what you find is that theta frequency, at least in the data we were looking at, appeared to increase after the stimulus offset, and this increase in the power persists during the delay period. Okay, all right, and so here what's marked is the different durations of the delay period, and you can see that in the successful trials, and you can see that it shows that this increase in the theta power, right, sort of extends to the duration of the delay period. Right. And apparently there's data that if that is not the case, the animal doesn't do well, okay, on the task. All right. Okay. All right, so another way to look at it is look at at a color map of theta power, right? And here's an example right, where you see a very nice clear increase in the theta power after the stimulus offset, right, persisting during the delay period. Okay. All right. So, okay, gamma during the load in, right, theta during persistence, okay, all right. And then if you look at what happens to the alpha, and you know, alpha is a bit less clear what's going on, right? But what you do see is that there's alpha power increases at the stage where you need to clear the memory, okay? And also it correlates with the sort of distractor inhibition, right? Particularly posterior sensory alpha, right? And this is data that comes from Ole Jensen's lab. Okay, so here's was our idea. Okay, the idea was that how can you sort of flip between these gating modes? Well, our idea was, what if it's the alterations in the spectral content of the inputs coming to our working memory network that actually allow us to flip rapidly and dynamically between the different gating modes, and that enables the network to perform the different kind of operations on the inputs, right? So it would be gamma gate in, theta arrays, okay, gate out, and alpha, sorry. Okay. Long dinner last night. Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. And theta would somehow implement this selective gating. Okay, this is a marvelous idea. Okay, I can write position papers, all kinds of stuff, right? But since I'm a neuromodeler, I want to figure out like, well, how would it actually work, right? Okay, so in order to study that question, right, we build very simple models of spiking networks that are capable of self-sustaining persistent activity. Okay, so the version I'm going to tell you about was like the 1.0 version of this model, right? Okay, so the constituent neurons were the quadratic integrated fires. Thank you, Steve, for introducing this model. Okay, all right, that were recurrently coupled with recurrent excitation, all right, synaptically, all right, and received sort of a background inhibition, right? And here we're considering one population of these guys, right? And they're randomly coupled between each other. Okay, all right. So now we're only at that time thinking only about fast excitatory recurrent synapses, so AMPA-like, right? The connectivity is sparse, and then we're considering a population of neurons anywhere between 100 and 1,000. We do 10,000, doesn't really change so much. Okay, all right. So, and then we are going to consider kind of a background synaptic input noise generated by the Poisson process. Okay, right? And it's pretty standard, right? It's the stimulus, the sensory stimulus that we're going to consider is a transient increase in the, in the rate of these Poisson time synapses. Okay, all right. So now how do we put oscillations in it? Okay, so this is your basic simulation. Here you go. Here's a stimulus that comes in, right? And this network starts firing persistently. And if you track some kind of an ersatz, local field potential that will track the total strength of the synaptic inputs for, as a function of time, you see that there is a kind of a persistence rate. So if we did, if we counted the spikes, we'd get pretty much similar things. Okay, so this toy model does what we wanted. Okay, all right, we would not expect it otherwise. Okay, all right. So now, what do we do with these oscillations? Okay, one choice would be just to say we're going to have a sinusoid current input to the model, right? But actually, if you look from a point of view of a single neuron, right, it's not receiving some kind of a current, right? It's receiving a temporally modulated synaptic inputs. Okay, so the way we constructed these temporally modulated synaptic inputs is by starting with independent sources of these Poisson inputs, all right, and then imposing on them, right, periodically modulated correlations. Okay, So now what we're building is a kind of a bursty periodic input. Okay. All right. So if you wanted to sum all of them, including the inhibitory cell interactions, you will get a sinusoid. Right. But this seems to be more, well, in our minds was a bit more compatible with what you would expect. Okay. All right. And so now we have these periodic modulation of the firing rate. Okay. We can change the strength of this modulation, right? Of this correlation, and we can change the frequency, right? So we got parameters that we can play with. Okay, and now we're going to study what these structured inputs and correlated inputs do to the dynamics of our network as a function of the frequency, right, and amplitude. So we'll forget about the amplitude for now. We're going to make them strong enough to give us something interesting, and we're going to change the frequency. Okay, all right. So, and then something interesting happens, okay? If we start our network in a persistent activity, okay? All right, so here it is. So we had a stimulus, okay, that activated our network, okay? All right, first of all, if we now track the firing rate of our network, we see that it's not constant, but it does have some temporal structure to it. We're still trying to understand where that comes from. But if at some point during its persistent activity, you now turn on these coherent sort of correlated oscillatory modulation of the background input. So this is input that goes to all the neurons, okay? When you find that if it is, let's say around 12 hertz, it turns it off, okay? If you increase the frequency a bit more, well, you get, locking, right? You get sort of periodic activity that is in fact persists, okay? All right, so that's what we want. Okay. Absolutely, just the frequency, right? Not changing the strength of correlation. Okay. All right. And so now what we did is we said, okay, so let's look at how, gamma, theta, and alpha frequencies of our modulation of the input, right, would impact the persistent activity in our network. Okay, so as you see, gamma doesn't do anything to the persistence. Okay, all right, okay. Alpha wipes it out, first of all, okay, all right. And interestingly, alpha also does not allow persistent activity to turn on, okay, all right. So here I'm turning on alpha during the persistent state. It turns it off, just like in the previous slide. Here I have a background during the transient stimulus input, right? So, and what you see is that if there is background alpha, right, you do get a transient response in the network to the stimulus itself, but it just doesn't go up to the persistent state, okay? Interestingly, for the theta, if you turn it on when the persistent state has already been initiated, okay, you get theta activity in the persistent state that is still there, right? It persists, okay? If you now have background theta that is there before our sensory stimulus comes on, it's just like in the alpha, right? You get a transient response to the stimulus, but there's no persistent state. Okay, all right. So, I can stop here, right? More or less. We got it. Okay, all right. So gamma, you allow things to be gated, to be loaded in, does not perturb the persistence. All right, the background gamma input gives you gamma power in the persistent state. Okay, theta gives you a selective gate, right? The item that has been loaded beforehand stays. New items are not allowed. Okay, and alpha would would wipe the slate clean for the next item to go. Okay. All right. So, well, yeah.
If I need the natural frame rate of the system, does it match any of those frequencies? I guess it's faster.
Yeah, it's faster, I guess. Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is a proof of principle. Let's say best representative example. Okay. So now, let's go a little bit beyond and sort of say, how could we characterize the reason why, these different frequency bands could implement the kind of operations that we want for working memory, right? Okay, so what we can do is we can now do stochastic simulations, right? We have noise inputs, right? So we can run large quantities, large bodies of simulations and track the probabilities of either blocking the input, all right? So transition from ground state to persistent state, okay, as a function of the input frequency, right? Or the probability of erasing an already pre-existing persistent state, okay, if you turn on the oscillations, okay? And so interesting, what we see is that, at the lower end of the input frequency band, there is a large separation between these two probabilities, right? So our network here, that we have a low probability of persistent activity to be turned off, right? And a high probability of de novo input to be blocked, okay? So when we're around this band, which is around, alpha, if you squint enough, right? You got to take off your glasses and sort of, right? You see that those two probabilities are quite close to each other, right? So you're much more probable to erase and not allowed to persist. Okay. All right. And then these probabilities for blocking and erasing, they sort of wear off as you get into the higher band. All right. Okay, and so now we can sort of, characterize what we call this gating mode prevalence, right? This probability of implementing the different kind of operations, right? Of shifting between the different gating modes, right? So when you're in the theta, right, you have a prevalence for the selective gating mode, right? Keep what you got, don't let anybody in, don't perturb, right? When you are in the alpha, the prevalence is for the gate out mode, okay, and the gamma is basically the prevalence for the gate in, load in mode. All right. Okay, so this allows us, this allows us to essentially scroll through the different contingencies that are necessary for working memory and scroll through them rapidly without any recourse to synaptic modification, connectivity modification, changes in the intrinsic excitability or anything like that. Okay. All right. Okay, so that was like one population model, basically just sort of considering what the different input frequencies would do, right? And so now we can sort of consider two different versions of our model, right? If we want to talk about, let's say, two items, if we want to talk about distractors, right, we need to talk about one item that we want to remember and another item that is not relevant to the task, right? It's the distractor. Okay, so we can consider a local model where we have the two item populations, interact with each other, first of all, and second of all, to receive pretty much the same sort of background. Yeah, okay, I'm almost done. All right, background synaptic input. Okay, right, and this is what I'm going to talk about, but we can also consider a cross-hemispheric model, right, where essentially you have these two items in two different hemispheres, right? I'm not going to get to that, but it's also that. Okay, and so if we consider this local model, right, then we can build our delay match to sample with distractor task, right? So here you have an item that comes in, activates the blue network, okay, right? If we shift the background input to theta input, this blue network keeps on firing now because it's locked to the theta at theta power, right? When the red stimulus comes in, all right, it cannot activate the red network, okay, all right? And then at the end of the time, when you need to sort of respond and erase, you can turn on the alpha and then it erases. Okay, everything is done now with excitatory inputs, right? There's no sort of flip between the stimulus turning it on, being excitatory, and turning it off with inhibitory. Okay, and so yeah, you can run a large body of these simulations, track statistics, right? And basically show that under these conditions, you have high probability of success and all of these sort of constituent operations that you need to do for this task. Okay. Okay. And then, you know, for presentation purposes, right? You know, we can make a simulated time power, what is it called? Spectrogram, essentially, right? Right, that again, if you squint enough, matches the experimental data, but it's qualitatively smells like what you would see in the data. Okay, all right. Interestingly, what falls out of this mechanism is that these operations for preventing or not preventing the distractors coming in, all these operations are phase dependent, right? So there's a dependence on the phase of the background modulation that would, in fact, you know, allow or not allow for the operation for the gating to be done correctly or not correctly. And this maps fairly well on at least data from Ole Jensen's group from a few years. Okay, all right. So why is it working? Okay, so what's the background mechanism? Well, if you look at let's look at persistent activity suppression. All right. And what you find is that the persistent activity suppression correlates in our model, right, or is dependent on transient synchronization or synchronization that is induced by the background's periodic correlated stimulus, right? The more the background stimulus synchronizes the network, right, the more it destabilizes the persistent state. The more it does not allow the persistent state to be turned off. Right, so interestingly, firing rate effects are not sufficient to explain what's going on. Okay, all right. And so since I don't have any more time now, I'm going to conclude. Okay, all right. So what I've shown you is an example where I've shown you that, you know, data relevant changes in the background periodic correlation structure of inputs to a working memory model can shift it between the different dynamic gating modes, which allow it to, you know, implement the different parts or the functions that are necessary for working memory as a whole. Okay, all right. With the gamma band allowing access to the information, theta band providing maintenance and protection, right, and alpha providing clearance. Okay, and so the primary mechanism is the transient synchronization or partial or sufficient partial synchronization of the network. Okay, all right. So let's see what we got there. Okay, so. And the question that we've been working on so for the past few years now is, you know, what is the possible role of this kind of hypersynchrony that you would induce if these correlations are too strong, or the network becomes too sensitive to them, you know, and all kinds of pathologies that require working memory processing, right? Schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, etc. Right? And another speculation is that, you know, the kind of oscillatory frequency modulations that you see during general cognitive tasks that require cognitive effort could be what's hidden behind them is really their differential demand on the gating of working memory operations. Right. Okay. And so I want to thank the people who've actually done the work. Right. It's my former student Mario Di Popa, who is at Columbia. He's on the job market now, so grab him. He's good. Okay, and Nikita Novikov, who up to a week ago was in Moscow. Now he's hiding in Armenia. He got arrested and he had to escape. And then Alessandro Torcini and Marcin Shved in Poland. Okay. And I can talk for another hour. It's lunch. Okay, thank you.